compositions. Sorry.
Glad to know.
It's okay. What are the assumptions we carry with us about compositions and practices of gathering, editing, refinement, and expansions? Terms, of course, that are already familiar to us by scholars of antiquity. So to call something a collection carries with it many contemporary concepts that may or may not be relevant to the processes of composition in antiquity. And so when we consider texts from antiquity, what are the principles of collection? We want to use these probing questions today in order to rethink the nature of composition and of organization and production, composition of the texts discovered in the 11 caves of Khirbet Qumran and other related and roughly contemporaneous discoveries. Many of the Dead Sea Scrolls consist of assembled collections of psalms or hymns or prayers, rules, laws, exegetical interpretations, mystical and cosmic reflections, and scientific calculations. There is also recently some debate over whether a scroll which preserves seemingly unrelated texts on the front of the back of the scroll, an epistograph, should be called a collection. And there's a doctoral student from Groningen, Ayaan Aksu, in this audience who's working now on that very project. Scholars have continued to assess texts in the forms of scrolls, inscriptions, and codices from antiquity through the Middle Ages. Often these collections are attested in variant forms. For example, Ben Sira is found in Hebrew fragmented manuscripts in the Second Temple period, but we also have later medieval copies from the Cairo Geniza. In 2014, Eibert and I co-authored an article entitled A Preparatory Study of Nomenclature and Text Designation in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or What's in a Name. In a sense, that article prepared the way for us to ask our question today about collection. There we asked, what's in a name? And how we as scholars might think about the assumptions and impositions. I'm sorry, 1 second. We discovered, sorry, I'll just start that sentence again. There we asked what's in a name and how we as scholars might think about the assumptions and impositions on the scrolls that were discovered with respect to how they were named and categorized by the first generation of scroll scholars who were trying to fit or squeeze the scrolls, if you will, into already existing category from the Hebrew Bible, from the New Testament, from ancient Judaism and early Christianity. We wondered out loud then about how we might rethink those presuppositions with respect to their assigned nomenclatures like Genesis Apocryphon or Pseudo-Jeremiah. To be sure, so many of the names assigned as titles for newly discovered works reflect how our cultural and religious expectations force the scrolls back into one box or another after they had been buried in one cave or another for 2,000 years. In asking then what is in a name, we asked how and if the scrolls themselves can provide us with the information of how the ancients named or identified their own texts. We also wanted to reflect on our own creative contribution to the identification and reception of the Dead Sea Scrolls as scholars. The first generation, the second generation, and the third generation of scholars. We demonstrated a number of texts that were read and transmitted in light of the titles that were given to them. Today, then, we want to consider the way the composition and assembly of the scrolls themselves are characterized by scholars. We are responsible, of course, for our own anachronistic characterization or imposition. It's inevitable, of course. But more importantly, we want to reflect on how our own assumptions about the formation of the biblical canon, the authority and fixity of biblical books, and the assembly and editing of those books took place. To be sure, there is much that we cannot answer definitively, but we can certainly try to use the information from the scrolls themselves in order to better understand and at times even to rethink our own preconceived notions of what writing, collection, assembly, and transmission looked like in antiquity. Much like the nomenclature article, we are looking to the scrolls to teach us more about antiquity instead of trying to squeeze the scrolls into what we already consider to be operative in the exilic, post-exilic, or more generally called the Second Temple period. And thus, this presentation is part of a larger project where we are rethinking accounts of collection and assembly for the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship in particular, and the study of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism more generally, right? So we're thinking about collections like Proverbs or Psalms or Breshit Rabbah. Not unlike scholars of antiquity in contemporary contexts, we also collect and we organize. We even ascribe authorship to anonymous texts that we call collections. We make assumptions about our own scholarly practices and presuppositions. Thus, in considering the matter of collection, we want to understand that underlying this is a question of compositional history and hence also source critical analysis. The traditional literary historical focus on reconstructing an original or authorial text as a whole is of course problematic. This awareness first arose in fields of philology, Greek and Hebrew. These are fields that were dealing with widely variant manuscript traditions of specific literary compositions. These practices expanded across periods and disciplines such as medieval studies, Assyriology, or within the wide range of biblical studies, early Christian Apocrypha, as well as a new emerging subfield over now around 75 years old, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In many ways, the assumptions about authorial intention still inform conversations about biblical texts. And part of what we want to do today is to rethink with you assumptions about how we as scholars assume knowledge about what was intended by the so-called singular author to whom the work is ascribed. But we also want to reflect on ways in which we inevitably shape antiquity in our own image. It is not that we as scholars can't achieve distance from our past, but it is inevitable that we draw upon categories and expectations that we carry with us when we read texts from antiquity. Soon after our nomenclature article, we edited an issue of Revue de Qumran dedicated to thinking about the composition of jubilees. And we considered a model of progressive composition in a little piece that we called Unity After Fragmentation. There we challenged the scholarly fragmentation of jubilees, but nevertheless acknowledged that it had a compositional history embedded within it. And here I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs that we wrote in 2014. So this is from myself and Eibert. We want to make an appeal for a progressive approach to composition history in the case of the Book of Jubilees. And to that end, I want to say we could generalize this to many texts, biblical and extra-biblical. To that extent, then, their approaches in the edited volume of the papers that we put together in this issue were retrospective. If we can reconstruct the single authored harmonies from which the disharmonies of Jubilees were composed, the assumption is that we will understand what Jubilees was and what it became. Perhaps, we wrote, we can never fully determine the history of composition, and the assumption that single authored texts are harmonious and that harmonious texts are single authored is false. Instead of using contradictions to look backwards in the hope of finding sources, we can use them to look forwards, we suggested, to study the dynamic development of scriptural tradition. A text then is like a movie. Just as it's possible to break the movie down into static frames, so too, we can break the text down into reconstructed sources. In some sense, the movie is composed out of frames and the text is composed out of layers. But if we look only at the frames separately, we will not understand the flow of the movie, let alone the connections that exist at a holistic level between this movie and other movies with which it's interacting. Similarly, if we look only at the sources of the text, we risk missing the flow of the text, which not only gives it unity as a text, but also which unites it with other scriptural texts that participate in the same creative process. So in quoting two passages from our article, we're trying to push our argument a little bit forward as we think about collection as a whole, right? We're thinking together with you today about how collections, both within a collection and the larger, collection of texts designated as Cave 1 or Cave 4, and more generally what Frank Moore-Cross and others have actually called a library. We want to think with you about what it means to think about them together. And if we can understand the history of these texts, does that mean that's where we stop? Or can we reassemble a dynamic and forward-moving gesture which contributes to ongoing processes of vitality of scripture? So we have a general set of questions about the way we reconstruct antiquity, and we focus on the fundamental and essential processes of textual composition and transmission, namely the state in which we discovered the scrolls, in a state of some kind of collection or assembly. The so-called work or text that we discovered is generally a collection of interpretations, prayers, or legal prescriptions. These texts are woven together into a single whole by scholars. Much of the work we do as scholars is to try to understand that material that we discover and decipher, but we do that from our pre-existing starting points. Our scientific approaches, our analysis, the digital humanities, our interpretive abilities, our knowledge of intertext or texts that are being called upon or invoked in the text, as well as joints and signs and handwriting. What are we to do then with collections? To date, there's been no systematic treatment of how we use this term for the scrolls or how we understand the very act of collecting as a compositional and scribal practice with respect to the scrolls and more generally with respect to the Hebrew Bible. And there's one student in Oxford working on notions of collection in Proverbs and thinking more generally about how these processes are operative in the Hebrew Bible, named Hans Decker. So we've organized our presentation around 4 questions, which I'm going to share with you now. We understand these questions only to be a starting point for our larger conceptual question or concern about what is collection. We hope that this contributes in a small way to the exploration of the literary and cultural modes of collecting in ancient Jewish texts from the Hellenistic period, as we seek to put our own texts in conversation with contemporaneous collections from antiquity. So, number 1, we want to think about how we as scholars understand the very notion of collection. Furthermore, how are we to use the term collection over against composition or compilation? This is about the modern context. What do scholars mean by the term? Is it an aggregate or a compilation? And can we distinguish these two from each other? Secondly, a point of exploration is about the process of collecting. Can we recognize the process of collecting on the part of our ancient scribes in the extant artifacts? Can we discern processes of collection in antiquity? Can we speak about deliberate and strategic planning on the part of the ascribed author with respect to assembling text into a single scroll or unit? What we're going to do now in the second half of our paper is to focus on single scrolls or artifacts, which are collections of ready-made textual materials which are brought together. But we also signal that one can consider other collections, such as materially, those of multiple scrolls, perhaps intentionally joined into one and the same jar, or literally multiple works that should be considered together. For example, the 5 books of Moses, which all 5 books together don't exist on a single scroll, right, in Qumran. In the third stage, we identify examples of specific scrolls where we can see the process of scribal collection through physical signals and material evidence. So we can see signs of attachment and gathering of sections through scribal transition and transmission. And finally, we will set out to briefly reflect on whether we can make collection meaningful, that is, interpreting collection. Part 2. What is a collection then? In a discussion of the 13th century collection of the Cantigas de Santa Maria, Stephen Parkinson and Deidre Jackson tried to identify the different processes that led to the Cantigas and differentiated between 3 major active phases of those collections: composition and compilation. Admittedly, the Cantigas is a major complex work, including narrative, images, and songs, unlike anything found in the scrolls, but their description of collection may at least help for comparative purposes. Quote, and this is the quote on your screen: "Collection is the process of acquiring narrative or literary materials. This should not be seen as a passive process of reception, but an active one of procurement. It includes the incorporation of ready-made miracle stories in written or oral form, the borrowing of schematic tales from secular or religious traditions, and the recording of personal recollections. This process then, which is described as acquiring, procurement, can be very useful as a comparative model for our collections amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as the construction or reconstruction of scrolls scholars as well. That is the work that we do in reassembling and bringing text together in what we call a work. For the scrolls, we have to reconstruct much of the historical context and sometimes also the material context. As a working definition then, we employ the concept of collection for artifacts or for texts that contain at least 2 different textual or literary units or objects which originally existed separately from one another. It's important then to emphasize that by collection, we do not insist upon an intended literary unit that was written in order to constitute a sequence of those units. But we could also include something like that. A good example then would be the variegated collection of the songs in the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, the Shirat Olat HaShabbat, which have a very specific language in common and seem to have been composed in a very structured way. This example of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice raises then the question of which other collections of psalms, prayers, or poems are collections of smaller ready-made units and which have been composed with larger works in mind. A further question concerns a work that is made up of excerpts from other works. Perhaps the best case would be 4Q 175, 4Q Testimonia, or slightly differently, when excerpts from other works are joined to or inserted in other sections. This would be the case in 4Q 491, where the text, a version of the self-glorification hymn known from the Hodayot, the Thanksgiving hymns, is included in the War Scroll manuscript. May we see excerpts as ready-made pieces, which are inserted into a different work as a collection? Or is it the case in 4Q 491, perhaps one of aggregation, that is not a deliberate assembly of similar works, as in the case of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice? I'm not going to get into why this matters, but I just want to signal to you that how we decide what it is that we're looking at has huge implications for how we interpret, how we connect it back to biblical materials, forward to later interpretive materials, and kind of horizontally to the larger Hellenistic context. One exciting but also challenging matter for us is that in many of our examples, we don't only see collection, but also the subsequent activities of composition and or compilation. We can see that as well, both of which would involve the revision or redaction of the collected materials. This is in part what we meant above when we mentioned progressive practices of compilation, collection, and editing. We've written elsewhere about how this has implications for Jubilees, but Jubilees, I think, is a great example of this. This is also likely the case in a variety of texts dealing with community liturgies or laws. With regard to the latter, we may discuss whether many of the legal manuscripts from K4 are actually works or law compositions, or in contrast, a random assembly of laws, whereby it's more about a category than a collection, which can offer meaning by virtue of the whole and the juxtaposition of the parts. So one might have to consider two different options, namely, collections which juxtapose originally independent texts without any thorough attempt to combine them, and collections which have been assembled into subsequent composition or compilations.
These scrolls.
We should pause here to point out that even the way we are describing what was found is always entangled in a complex web of scholarly reflection and assessment and reconstruction, as well as ancient models of assembly, composition, and compilation. We cannot responsibly speak about the intention behind the organization of the collection, but we can describe what we find and discern. And of course, we must acknowledge that much of what we're analyzing is our own construct and assumption. A special case of epistagraphs, scrolls with texts inscribed on both sides, mentioned earlier the recent research of Ayan Aksu, we should ask whether different literary materials have been brought together deliberately, or whether the writing on the front of the backside is just a convenient way of recording and transmitting materials. Additionally, some of the so-called variant literary editions of works may actually be related to variant collections and possible subsequent composition or compilation, or in other words, collection results in variant literary editions or texts, and hence, we need to be mindful of the full extent of the possible dimensions of collection as a concept for the scrolls. In sum, with our working definition of collection referring to artifacts or texts that contain at least two different ready-made textual or literary units that have been brought together, we still have a variety of possible collections in the scrolls, but also a variety of kinds of collections within the Khirbet Qumran discoveries. And now over to Eibert.
Mark, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Given the sparsity and the fragmentary nature, and a lot of the pictures that you will see are fragments of our materials in the Dead Sea Scrolls, how do we recognize a collection? We are talking about collection, but how can we see them? We do not have one single criterion to recognize collections. And yet, amongst the scrolls, we find a range of features which, in our opinion, could be indicative of collection practices. And I'll discuss a few and I'll make some comments on the pictures. Literary evidence for collection can be found in those cases where we have textual variance among two or more manuscripts, and especially where the variance is found in the combination or sequence of literary units. And the picture you see on the right of the screen is from three different manuscripts of the Seder Hayacha, the rule of the community. And those who have been working with them will see that even though the text is different, the same unit starts all three times on a new sheet or a new column. Second, strong scribal evidence of collection. So we're not talking here about literary evidence, which is something completely different, but scribal evidence of collection is found where separate literary parts of a scroll start on separate sheets. And it's a good example you see at the very bottom picture you have, or they start on a new column, as on the top image you have, or are separated in other manuscripts by multiple blank lines. And actually we have a couple of scrolls where new units start on a new sheet or column. Another feature, subheadings in a work may be either of a compositional literary nature, that is, an author composing a text with a title, and one of the examples which is not shown here is that it starts with, in the middle of a scroll, Book of the Words of Noah, or subheadings may indicate ready-made units which already existed but which have been collected. And one of those may be this, what you see at the bottom of the screen, Midrash LeMaskil. And another case of a heading you will find at the top, Tehillah Le'ish Elohim. And each of these cases is, other than what we do, we start on the new page, etc. Often it doesn't happen, we just need a heading. Appearance of the same or a similar literary unit in different works is a very strong indication that we have issues of collection, at least in at least one of those scrolls. And we actually have, and this will be interesting for all those who are working on the scrolls, a lot of different examples. We have sometimes almost the same penal codes expressing the kind of punishment for specific violations in completely different compositions. We have a so-called self-glorification hymn in two completely different works. Here on the picture, you see at the very end of what is remaining from this scroll, Psalm 91, which of course is also found in the Psalter. Another case is Psalm 122, and we have the section from Nahum against Nineveh in the text, which is attributed to Nineveh. All those are indicate ready-made units that are collected by scribes. Occasionally, different parts of one scroll and different parts of a text are characterized by different spelling practices or morphological or lexical choices, which should suggest different origins of the units. This means that the scribes who collected did not always harmonize the spelling with the other sections or the morphology. And there are a lot of different examples one can give. One can see that in some sections of the rule of the community, the Seder Hayachat, it consistently uses olamim for eternal. But then in another section, it only uses the word olam. Or a completely different case in this kind of Dead Sea Scrolls Hebrew, we have actually two different ways of writing the suffix for yor, cha. And we have scrolls where one section uses one way and the other section uses the other way. And actually only 2 hours ago, I listened to a different lecture where Ed Cook gave an example how a specific poem in 4Q212 has a cluster of strange linguistic spellings and features which sets it apart from the entire context. And we have many of those. Another way of features that are indicative of collection practices, and I'll just go very quickly through them. I already mentioned that we could headings, but we also have introductory headings of one word, le masquille, or in many of the laws, we have just the introductory al, we could say in English something like about. Or what we occasionally have, we have completely, and we'll get an example later, get several examples later in the presentation. We have different genres in the text that one even wonders, what are they doing together apart from being collected together? Or sometimes, and this is what you can see in the right blue circle, we have scribal markers in the manuscript, which in itself does not indicate a collection, but it could indicate a new beginning or a new section of something. However, in many of the features I just mentioned, many of those are only indicative, and there are obstacles in recognizing collection. And even more problematic is linking collection with interpretive processes. For example, from a manuscript perspective, one should wonder why a scribe would collect multiple literary units in one and the same physical artifact. Some collections would be held together by a narrative of some kind, but need this always be the case? And by a narrative, I actually mean, I haven't written it down, that either we as interpreters try to think for a reason why these specific sections are placed one after another, or that we try to imagine why ancient authors or scribes did that. Now, such a narrative would perhaps be expected in the case of large and neatly written scrolls with multiple different texts that seem connected in respect of content or otherwise. And some of these examples you see on the screen, that would be the collection of what we call 1QS, the Serga Yagat, 1QSA, Serga Eda, and SB Berachot, together very large and different sections, or the large Cave 1 Hodayot scroll. But perhaps we could also think of some kind of narrative of a development or a connection between the parts in the Cave 1 War scroll. Or, for example, the 4Q203-204 manuscript, which contains a series of works which are attributed to Enoch. And one of the possible connections or narratives is not only that they belong to Enoch, but it has been argued that they actually follow the biography or the life of Enoch. But should we also expect a narrative in the case of epistographs or in informally written scrolls, where perhaps only pragmatic or economic considerations may have determined the juxtaposition of ready-made textual units? Question mark. Scribal features may point in a specific direction as well as to ancient interpretive processes. We, as modern interpreters, then try to discern a coherent narrative that would have held the collection together. I apologize, sometimes it clicks twice. A different kind of uncertainty, if we are talking about collection, applies to the assessment of variant forms of textual works or collections, one shorter and the other longer. Is the longer form of a text evidence of possible collection? Have things been added or additional materials? Or is the shorter form of a work the result of a process of excerption or abbreviation? Now, a major methodological problem for recognizing collection is the fragmentary nature of our materials, especially, and this is an image which you see here from K4, And some of you may know the beautiful scrolls that are often shown, which are in the Shrine of the Book, but many, actually hundreds or perhaps even thousands of examples of what you see here, that 10 or 20 fragments are just placed together on a plate, and we see them as the remnants of a manuscript. So with K4, we often have the difficulty of constructing manuscripts. And due to the editor's constructions of manuscripts, one may find collections in one manuscript, whereas in fact the different literary units may reflect 2 or more manuscripts written by the same scribe. This, we think, holds for works, for several works, for example, 4Q176. Or exactly the other way around, scholars may have split up fragments of one and the same manuscripts because they thought they were generically different, without acknowledging the possibility of collection. And those who want to have examples can write us afterwards. Yet another material and scribal feature needs to be taken into account, namely the limitation of a scroll as a scribal artifact. Now, many of you know the massive collections from late antiquity or from the Middle Ages, which only could have come into existence due to the possibilities of the codex, with sometimes thousands of pages. Collections of larger works on one and the same scroll are rare, as are collections of multiple Greek literary works on the Hellenistic and Roman period book rolls. And in fact, for larger works, partitioning of a work in different smaller units, each to be written on a single scroll, is the rule rather than collection. Collection in the Dead Sea Scrolls is therefore a matter of collection of smaller units rather than larger works, as in contrast to what one would find a few centuries later in Christian codices. Now, these are important limitations and problems for our project, which we need to continue to reflect on. But we nevertheless want to consider what it means to assemble texts and then to make sense of that collection as liturgy or as narrative, or just as a haphazard, if we may say that, grouping of unrelated texts. Now, our work is still preliminary, but we already wish to make a survey of texts of manuscripts that might be collections. And one could wonder, is it new? Well, perhaps it's not special, but no one has done that before, and that is why we started doing that. A first category consists of those collections which can be recognized due to differences between manuscripts. Now, what we have here is one of the clearest cases of collection, namely that of the Tehillim or Psalms. Now, one of the great surprises of the discovery of the scrolls was this so-called Great Psalm Scroll from Cave 11. Now, this Psalm Scroll covers the last part of the biblical Psalter. We are not sure how much back it went, but this is what remains. But the sequence of the Psalms in this scroll is frequently different from the one you know from your Bible. And this Cave 11 scroll also contained additional Psalms and even a short prose section on David and the kinds and numbers of songs he wrote. Now, we want to share with you not only pictures of scrolls, which some of you may read and other ones may not, but we also want to share some texts which show something about collection. Now, what you see on the right bottom is the remnant of one of the many columns, and at the very top, which was the first line of the column, you see the end of 2 Samuel 23:7, and then a section which we call David's compositions, because we will read it very quickly or go through it, and then the scroll just continues with Psalm 140 and other Psalms. So what happens here? I'm not going to read all of the text, but just a few sections. Now, this prose section says that David, the son of Jesse, was wise and like the light of the sun, and he was literate and discerning and perfect in all his ways before God and men. And the Lord gave him a discerning and enlightened spirit, and he wrote, and then we get a complete list of the kind of songs and the number of songs that David had been given from God through prophecy. Now, since this text has become known in, I think, from the late 60s on, it has revolutionized our way of thinking about not only the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also about the Psalms. All of a sudden, from the early 1970s on, there has been a large boom in scholarship on trying to understand how the Psalms had been collected. Also, other Psalm scrolls, not as well preserved as this one, have similar collections of both biblical and apocryphal Psalms, though, of course, these are our anachronistic labels. We can really doubt whether the scribes made such a distinction, which I just mentioned, between biblical and apocryphal. The second example, and perhaps the best known example of a collection, is the Seder, or the rule of the community, called in German by a famous scholar ein Sammelhandschrift. I'm not sure the English word, a collection manuscript or something like that, which consisted of 4 or 5 or perhaps even more, but certainly 4 originally independent units which have been added one to after another, even though we can also see signs of compilation after the things had been collected. So very briefly, and you can see it here, and I don't even have, I'll just 4 parts, 1 to 4, rule of the community, and what we call the Two Spirits Treatise. So actually this first part already consists of several parts, and the same holds true for the second part, columns 5 to 11, with the rules, different kinds of rules, with punishments and the hymn, and then we have rule of the congregation and the blessings. Why have these been fitted together? Interesting that we also have other examples of the Seder Hayachat, or rule of the community, and that all the large ones that we have, none of them is exactly the same. They all have different kinds of units. They lack units, and one even has another unit which is even not in this large scroll. And also we have separate attestations of what is here 1QSA and SB. Now, just to give you an example of the heterogeneity of the different genres in this scroll, we just look briefly at a few texts. And these are 4 quotations. I will quickly run through them. I will not explain them, but just give you an impression of the complete differences that we find in this scroll. The section from the Two Spirits Treatise in column 3. He, that is God, created man to rule the world and placed within him 2 spirits, so that he would walk with them until the moment of his visitation. They are the spirits of truth and deceit, and from the spring of light stem the generations of truth, and from the source of darkness the generations of deceit. And this goes on for 1 more column, and it has been called a kind of theological tractate. But then a few columns further, it deals with very practical matters about how one would congregate, each one by his rank. The priest will sit down first, the elders next, and the remainder will sit down in order of rank. And following the same system, they shall be questioned with regard to judgment, all counsel, and any matter referred to this group of the many, so that each can impart his knowledge. And this goes on and on and on. But then 2 columns later, we have a hymn. With the offering of lips, I, who is this I, shall bless him in accordance with the decree recorded forever. I will sing with knowledge, and for the glory of God shall all my music be. And it goes on and on. So this is only to give you an impression. And then 2 columns later, but we call it a different composition, 1QSA. And this is the rule for the armies of the congregation for all native Israelites. And then it starts dealing with how someone from childhood to old age has different functions in this congregation. Now, these sections consist of material of entirely different genre and content, and I mentioned those of most of them, and I have omitted other parts because it would be too much. Now, this is a great example of collection, and it's also, and I haven't worked it out, but one that would be a challenge just to see how scholars have construed narratives to explain why these different units were compiled in this specific sequence. Whether that was, goes away now, what happened here? Whether it was a sequence of historicity of different pieces put together, or a sequence of gradual becoming part of a group, and there are many different narratives that scholars have developed. Another example, and we here, those who know a lot about the scrolls will not be amazed about these examples. I very quickly will run through them. The Hodayot or Thanksgiving scrolls, we now know that the one from cave 1 has more units than the ones in cave 4. The Milchama or war scrolls, we have different forms of this Serach Milchama in the different scrolls and different compositions, and I won't go into details. And we have the famous scroll that became first known in the 1990s. Actually, it's not a scroll, but different scrolls, and we have to fit them together. And there are different sections, especially in 4Q394, one of the 6 copies of this scroll. There are 3 parts, and no other one has these 3 parts. And we see this collection in all kinds of scrolls. If there's any specific scroll one is interested in, perhaps in a Q&A, there could be time, but I'll just, for matter of time, I'll just continue. Now we have, just to give you an overview of how many different kinds of collections we have a series, and there was just a conference on it for 3 days on the Zoom conference on the different collections of Enochic manuscripts. And one of those, and it has 2 numbers, but many scholars think it's actually only 1 manuscript, has a collection of a range of 5 different books that are attributed or related to the figure of Enoch. And one could again call this in German a Sammelhandschrift, because it contains the Book of Watches, the Book of Giants, and 3 more. And the same we have with the so-called astronomical Enoch, where one of those seems to have 2 different parts, 2 different collections put together, perhaps because the first doesn't have anything to do with Enoch, but there were 2 texts that dealt with astronomy and put together in one astronomical scroll. Of course, and this is well known to you, but we can say more about that already in antiquity, and certainly in the Masoretic text, we have a collection of 12 minor prophets, but at least one of the manuscripts of minor prophets has a different sequence or compilation, and we're not even sure whether all the scrolls of the minor prophets that we found in Qumran really had all these 12 prophets. So we are perhaps standing in the process of collection of the 12 prophets. Berachot, I will just mention that there's one that may be a collection, and that all the other ones that are Berachot only have one of the sections of the collection. We have non-canonical psalms. We call them non-canonical. We have no clue how in antiquity they would have given the name. At the very beginning, when Hindy Najman was still speaking, I think at the slide in What is in the Name, I showed you one of the very few titles, 2 of the very few titles that we actually have on the back of a scroll, which perhaps for the aid of a librarian told what is the title of this work, but mostly we don't know the titles. So these non-canonical psalms are clearly a collection of different ones, and we know that because one of the texts that is found in this collection is also found on a very small fragment, and we can see from the way of writing on that fragment that it probably was a standalone text. Another example, and this is also the picture that you see, the songs of the sage.
But I must urge caution, gentlemen. As a scientist,
I'll carry on. And then we have a series of texts that were called in the 80s and 90s reworked Pentateuch manuscripts, but many scholars now say it's not reworked Pentateuch, it's just a different kind of Pentateuch. But these are strange collections, and most of my colleagues think that they are just collections from Genesis to Deuteronomy, but I'm not quite sure. It could be that some of those only have a few of the Pentateuchal books. Now, these were examples, perhaps the best known, of major collections that we have and that differ. Each and every of the cases that I mentioned, there we have short or longer forms, parts miss, some of the collection is missing in other manuscripts, etc. But we also have another category, which we should mention, of what we could call standalone manuscripts, which themselves, in themselves alone, seem already to be a collection, even though we cannot compare. Now, this is a very special case. We don't understand how it was written like this. The top part of it is a form of Psalm 154, which is not in your Hebrew Bible, which is written in one column. And then we also have a prayer, and scholars disagree whether it's a prayer against or a prayer in favor of King Jonathan, which are written in two narrow columns. And we actually don't know how much more there was. And some scholars have made suggestions about what came after that. Another example is what you already saw, where Psalm 91 was at the very end, a series of apotropaic psalms protecting the ones who was praying them against demons. And we have, and this is a very special case, and it's a very large but very damaged scroll that we have, the Cave 1 Genesis Apocryphon, written in Aramaic. And I'll just go through the text, and of this, I'll just give you 3 very small samples to give you an impression what this text is about. Actually, what we have here from left to right, you see the figure of Lamech, Noah and Abram, and the sections that we have stretch from Lamech to Abram, and we don't know. Perhaps it even started with Adam and it ended with Joseph. Actually, we don't have a clue, but this is what we have, and that is already 22 or 23 columns. And parts of it are descriptions that we don't know at all from the Hebrew Bible. Just I'll read through it. Lamech knows that his wife is pregnant, and it suddenly occurred to him that a conception could have been from the watchers mentioned in Genesis 6, and the seed from the holy ones. Apology, this should be ones and not one. And then I, Lamech, was upset. So I approached my wife Batanosh and said to her, "You must tell me truthfully without lies." And it goes on, but I have to make it shorter. And then Batanosh, my wife, spoke with me very angrily and said, "Oh, my brother and my husband, recall for yourself my pleasure," etc. But then 3-4 columns later, all of a sudden, we have even the title, a copy of the book of the words of Noah. And it could be that the scribe has just selected a already ready-made book of Noah, which he completely incorporates in it. And this is the beginning, but it goes on for columns and columns and columns. When I, Noah, emerged from my mother's womb, I was planted for righteousness. All of my days I conducted myself uprightly. Now, this is not exciting, but if you read on, you will encounter Noah's dreams, which are explained. And then we have the Abram cycle, and the first part of Abram is still in the first person speech, and all of a sudden it just jumps, indicating a major break in the text. And after these things, God appeared to Abram, third person speech, and then it becomes very much like just a Targum, an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text. So we actually don't really know what kind of a work this is. It is clearly a collection of different things, but it's very difficult to determine what has been written specifically for this large collection and what has been what already was a ready-made piece. Other works may also have been collections, though the evidence is in this case more literary than material. Just as scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars had made the same argument for some parts of, for example, the prophet Isaiah or other parts, not because we have material evidence, but literary evidence. And I will just give you one, I will just point out the very bottom one, 4Q 176, and I won't go through the text, but it may just be fun to read with you what this is still part of a psalm, and then it has a new heading, Umin Sefer Yeshayahu Tan, what is it here, Tanchumim. And this may be the first reference that we have to this section of, and then it starts with quotations from Isaiah 40, etc. And then at some point it stops with the citation of Isaiah, and then it moves to Lamentations. So this is a kind of collections of small pieces of biblical parts and some pieces added to it. But what I want to share with you is one of the examples that Hindy already mentioned, examples where we have collection of laws, and sometimes we don't understand actually what is the reason behind all these different laws. Now, this is a text which at some point scholars, they couldn't think of a good name, and they just gave it the descriptive name miscellaneous rules, meaning, yeah, what is going on? Now, the first part is a quotation from Isaiah, and everything is fragmentary, so we don't know. It could be that this part of Isaiah was a kind of support or a peg or whatever for some kind of rule that perhaps it was not even related to rule. Now, one of the other fragments of 4Q265 looks actually like the penal code that we find in the rule of the community. I'll just read it, the second column. And he who raises his voice in foolish laughter, that is during a meeting, shall be punished half his bread for 15 days. So he will be ransomed. What is the word? Rationed, whatever. And the man who insults his fellow shall be punished for 30 days, meaning he will get only half of his food for 30 days. And someone who lies knowingly concerning any matter shall be punished 30 days. Now, try to imagine a text which on the one hand quotes Isaiah, and we don't know if it was before or after, but then deals with these rules and penalties. But the text also deals with Sabbath laws, and it goes on and on, but it's broken. And I just took out a few. On the Sabbath day, let no man put on soiled garments, and no garments which have dust or lint on them, and no man should carry out any vessel of food from his tent on the day of Sabbath. But it goes on about different things on the Sabbath. Okay, so these are rules, but then we have a completely different rule, and a rule is being introduced by a narrative. So in the first week, Adam was created, then Adam was created. Now, I can't read everything on the slide myself, but probably you can. He was brought to the Garden of Eden, and the bone of his bones was taken for a woman, and she was brought to him. And then the author or the text uses the different period of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as an explanation or as an argument, as a ground for the different amount of periods that a woman should be impure after she has given birth to either a male, 7 days, or a female, 14 days. I forgot where it is exactly. I think it is Leviticus 12, but I may be mistaken, 1 or 2 chapters. So this is, what kind of a collection is this? How should we understand this? How should we imagine a narrative, if you can use that word for collection? Hindy. Hindy Najman. I have missed my co-presentator. Oh, she's back. Okay. Hindy, your mic, you have to unmute.
Got it. Unmuted?
You can talk.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think you just gathered from Eibert and my earlier part of the paper how complicated this is. So both to think conceptually and textually about these challenges. And also we believe that there's meaning in collection. So interpreting collection, where should we go from here? Where can we go from here? On the one hand, we will have to differentiate between different kinds of collections, since, for example, the large K1 scrolls, Sarach HaYachad, Hodayot, and Milchama, are of a different kind than 4Q265, called by his editor miscellaneous rules, or the subsections of 1QS columns 5 to 9. We also need to think more generally with respect to the question of material and literary production. Again, this is something that Eibert, this latter point, has worked on a lot. We were only able to signal in the paper about how this will also have implications for how we think about collection and assembly, right? The interface between materiality and literariness. Are there certain categories or even genre that are more open to collection than others? So for example, the biblical text of Proverbs is an assembly of already collected units, whereas Kohelet seems to have collected a coherent narrative in sequence with a frame. There are many other such biblical and Hellenistic examples, but we feel it might be worthwhile to ask ourselves whether this also has something to do with the very nature of the author function. How does the situation change, for example, when we can identify a given composition as pseudonymous with respect to that text's said author? Can we or should we speak about intentional assembly? Does this intentional dimension also contribute to thinking interpretatively or hermeneutically? Does authorship play a role in the constitution of a work or collection? The place of hermeneutics and understanding collection is often overlooked. I argued in Seconding Sinai that our ancient authors interpreted an extended authority through false attribution or pseudonymous attribution, ascribing works to Moses across centuries, which I called Mosaic discourse. My case in point there today was Jubilees. And thus, here moving this argument a little bit further, we want to think about the interrelationship between hermeneutics and collection. It's difficult because we can't speak about intention, but we can try to reconstruct the placement of units through careful analysis of the evidence we have left behind. This is a topic to which we hope to return in a future collaboration. One aspect that we want to close with is that collections themselves are meaningful insofar as the editors or compilers, interpretive communities, scribal groups have assembled a sequence or multiple sequences in the reassembly or the reorganization of fragments of sources. And I do want to add that this continues. We're still assessing and reassessing the work of a generation ago or 2 generations ago. And thus variegated sequences of the collection will become the context now for scholarly narrative at the very least. And perhaps more than that, our scholarly practices, as well as those practices that we can discern and reconstruct from antiquity. We hope in this brief journey today that we have begun to open up a larger discussion about scholarly assumptions regarding composition, compilation, and collection as a way of categorizing our ancient Jewish texts and artifacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you very much, Hindy and Eibert, for this really insightful and eye-opening presentation, because you not only give us things to think about in this area of what we might call philological practices, how scribes worked, went about their work and organized their material, but there are also larger questions about how the material that we have fits into certain kinds of categories as collections, and why things fit together in the way they do. So you've really approached this question from very different points of view, and you've given us a wide range of interesting opinions and also information for us to work from, and examples of scrolls, which we don't always see at one time. So this has been really quite a fascinating and important discussion. And I'm very pleased to be able to have a few minutes to open up the floor for some questions. I have a list so far of 5 questions, starting off with Sasha Stern. Now, Sasha, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, hello.
Oh, there you are. Good.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Sasha, please.
Hi, Sasha.
Hello, hello. Hello, Hindy and Eibert. Can I begin by expressing my great enthusiasm for this paper, which I found incredibly inspiring, as it opens up a whole new approach to the scrolls, which would have been inconceivable a few decades back. And this is really cutting edge, a cutting edge analysis of the making of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I really find really important. I have actually 2 questions which are completely separate from one another. I'll ask both, and then you can make of them what you want. The first one is to do with collection. I must say that it took me a while to understand that what you were talking about was textual collection. In other words, the collection of texts, as opposed to the collection of scrolls. When someone tells me collection Dead Sea Scrolls, I immediately think of Cave 4 and of the librarianship sort of operation of putting together or bringing together different scrolls in one place, which is of course terribly meaningful and worthy of analysis in its own right. But that's a very different kind of thing from the collection of text, or the textual collection which you're talking about, which is equally important. Hindy, you rightly discuss the question of intention, and Eibert also. What does the author intend in bringing together these different sources? What should the reader, how should the reader look at these collections of texts? And I felt that there was an underlying sort of tendency on your part to assume that the intention always was to bring the different elements of the collection into relationship with one another. Now, you're absolutely right that this must have happened, and in fact it did happen, and this can be demonstrated in very many cases. But I think a little bit more caution should be exercised in some cases. I want to draw attention to example number 5 that Eibert brought up. I was actually thinking of it before it even came up on the screen, because it's a scroll which I am familiar with. You'll immediately understand why. It contains QMMT, a copy of QMMT, and before that, a calendar roster. Now, it seems to me that these 2 texts are actually completely disconnected from one another. There is no attempt on the part of the author to suggest even a relationship between them. On the slide, Eibert, you called it calendar discussion. If it were calendar discussion, I would be inclined to agree that this perhaps is part of a discussion with the discussion of purity laws and the polemical letter to the high priest in Jerusalem. But it really is not a discussion at all. It is just a very boring calendar list. If I tell you it's boring, you can believe me it is, yes, when it comes to calendars. It really is a very boring calendar list. And it seems to me that what we have here is a juxtaposition of 2 different texts on the same scroll, which is only there for scribal reasons, but without any intention of textual relationship. Now, this isn't to say that it's not interesting or meaningful. I find this very interesting and very meaningful. Why should the scribe have selected these 2 texts to copy into his scroll? Very much as you find in medieval codices, which you mentioned correctly. You can sometimes find codices which have a whole bundle of completely different literary compositions, but nevertheless, the thought behind it, you know, the scribe sort of deciding that he's going to include in his codex or in his scroll very different works, is also of significance, but it's a very different type of significance or meaning from the textual intertwining of collected texts, which this paper was very wonderfully trying to describe. So anyway, this is my first question. I suppose it's a remark really rather than a question, but I'm sure you've got what to answer back, so you can treat it as a question. My second question, very different, is sort of broadening out, because I really think there's something really important going on here. Broadening out, exactly the same analysis can and should be applied, for example, to early rabbinic literature. The way the Mishnah is composed, the Tosefta, the Halachic Midrashim, the Talmudim, the Agadic Midrash, everything, all different works of early rabbinic literature are exactly examples of these processes of textual collection and of emerging dialogues and combinations of these different collected bits. Of course, the difference is that in the case of early rabbinic literature, we do not have the manuscripts, whereas for the Dead Sea Scrolls, we do have the manuscripts. But nevertheless, the later medieval manuscripts of early rabbinic literature are enough, I think, to carry out exactly the same type of analysis. It would be very interesting if you could bring your own work in conversation with the work of people working on early rabbinic literature, because I really think it brings up exactly the same questions. And broadening even further, I would venture to say, although this is not my field, but I'm sure Mark will agree that looking at cuneiform literature, it's also exactly the same phenomenon, at least in very many cases. But then when I go elsewhere, and when I look, for example, at Greek and Latin literature, then it's not quite the same thing. In certain cases, one might find texts which emerge out of collections, but it's not in most cases anything like that. And I think we then have to ask another question, which is, why is it that this phenomenon can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in early rabbinic literature, in other words, in some types of literature, but not in others? We can't take it for granted. It's not just because the authors are Jewish or because they're located in Judea, Palestine, that automatically the same phenomenon will recur. I think this is something which has to be critically looked at. You know, why is it that in some cultures this is how literature develops and not in others? Okay, thank you very much.
Eibert, can I just start and then?
Go ahead.
Briefly, so first, it is not, it's also our intention to say when it's not collection. It's also our intention to talk about when a set of texts that are preserved side by side are not particularly meaningful or hermeneutically suggestive. And I think that there are other, I mean, Eibert will surely take this up more, but there are material issues. There are issues around economics, there are issues around inclusion, there's issues around copying and preservation that we need to consider. And this is certainly not exceptional. And it is true, we didn't talk about when is it not a collection. And I think that this is absolutely something that in the written form and a published form of this, we absolutely should write about, and thank you for raising it. The point about the two other points very briefly about rabbinics and Hellenistic world. So we absolutely are in conversation with rabbinicists that are thinking about collection and organization. And I think there's new work that must be done, even if we don't have the earliest manuscripts that are as early for that material. And in fact, Eibert had considered, we considered even including some of that discussion and to gesture towards that in this very presentation. So I think this is part of a much larger project, a project that we'd love to involve, well, for example, you and Mark, in issues around archive, issues around collection, issues around assembly, problematizing notions of library and of preservation or transmission as a part, also as an impulse towards collection. I would like to push back a little bit from the classicists that I work with and think with, that notions of expansion and growth of texts as a kind of collection and inclusion. I'm not sure that I would say that this is not to be found in the Greek and Latin materials. And my thinking is that in conversation with compositional practices, the margin and the canon, which is something we signaled, that it is certainly along the lines of didactic poetry. There are some classicists that are here actually in the audience. They might want to chime in. For example, I saw that Chris Krause is here, but but my impression is that we would not want to exclude the possibility that this is also coming out of a Hellenistic context where the growth and collection is operative. Okay, Eibert, did you?
I just want to add a comment on one thing that Sasha said. I think what we didn't mention is, of course, we have, if one works like this, you have to raise the question, is this intentional compositional collection, or is this scribal juxtaposition? And the example you take for MIT is a great example because it's written in the most inelegant, or let's call it the most vulgar semi-cursive script of all the MMT things, and which would strengthen the notion, and we have more of those, that these are often not intentional compositions, but whether you want to call them private copies or else, in any case, they were not written as, in a sense, to be divulged or not to be spread out as beautiful works to be used by other people. So because of the strange script of 4Q394, I would tend to take too harsh your comment that it's just a juxtaposition. But if you only have one or two of these things, I would want to make a rule of it, but we don't have enough to take that as a rule, but it is an indication.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sasha, for raising these issues and for the interesting answers. In the interest of time, we have 4 questions left, but I think I'll just read them out because they're more of a more general nature and less technical. So David asks about any of the theological subjects which might appear in the scrolls and be not part in the biblical canon. Do you encounter theological discussions that are not, is this common?
Well, may I answer, Hindy? I would say that I just gave a very short section on the 2 spirits, but there's an entire, well, it's for Western concept is not large, but it is 50 or 60 or 40 or 50 lines of what one could call dualistic, and which is hardly or not at all found in the Hebrew Bible as such. It has a different anthropology, it has a different cosmology. It's not a theological discussion, and one cannot say that it pervades the scrolls, but it has a very central place in one of the most important scrolls that we have.
Yeah, I mean, and Jan Dachorn has just written a long piece who wants to argue, right, that it's already always integrated into, it's part of Isaiah 45, and that it's actually not a Persian influence and it's not different. I mean, this is a huge debate now between John Collins and Jan Dachorn. But I do want to kind of build a little bit on what Eibert just said. There are new developments, but fundamentally, I think that this is part of the biblical imagination, part of thinking about God and about the cosmos and and creation. I think that these texts are very much integrated into what we would call ancient Jewish theology and ancient, Israelite religion.
Thank you very much. I won't ask David's second question because it's about the script and it's not really so relevant. We'll move on to the question of Arjen Bakker, who wants to know about whether the collections constitutes interpretation. Is there an interpretive element to these texts being collected together? An interesting question, I think.
Hindy.
I could start and then you'll continue. Is that okay? So I guess this is also follows from the previous question. Eibert and I both understand the scrolls, and this is true also of Arjen's research. We're really pushing against a notion of sectarianism, that this is very much, there might be innovations and kind of creative developments, but fundamentally it's part of what we would call the biblical world, biblical interpretations in the post-exilic period and beyond. But I say that in order to reflect a little bit on what we might mean by the interpretive, and in a way it's the other side of the coin. It's the other side of Sasha's question. When when we are examining these assembled collections, when we can see that units of text are put side by side, what can we say about a community that's both preserving and performing, articulating these texts, and how can we render them meaningful? That was the very end of our paper, which we certainly didn't develop, Arjen, and it's a really helpful question for us. We want to think hermeneutically about the specific examples that we're bringing to the table, and to try to understand how there is development across a collection, but always be mindful of two things. One is that many of these assemblies are done by us, so we have to be very careful when we talk about a teleological or a developmental gesture. And the second was the first part of Sasha's comment, which is sometimes texts are side by side, not for hermeneutical purposes and not for theological or dogmatic purposes, dogma, I mean. So on the one hand, I want to think out loud with our students, with ourselves as we read and think about the different parts and give an account, but I want to do it with a lot of humility. That is, we're not sure, we don't know how they put together, but we can read these texts along with other texts from the period, early and later, and begin to construct accounts of redemption, exile, perfection, and even perceive practices of reading by studying different units that are juxtaposed to one another. And I guess the last point is this question also, Arjen, of course, also applies to the biblical corpus more generally. Just like Sasha is encouraging us to collaborate and move forward in time, we also have to reflect back in time with respect to biblical tradition, which are also assembled, and how much meaning can we assign to these collections? Eibert?
Just a very short comment adding to that. If we look, for example, at the 4 different biblical quotations that are put together in testimonial, it raises the question that by taking these verses together, and of course you have it later in Midrash, you have the same phenomenon, that by putting them together, you give a new meaning to them in that new context. And that holds true for Bible, for scripture, but it also holds true for perhaps many of the pieces that we think are ready-made pieces which have been collected. So they, even in the example of Sasha, where we would have, there is a reason why these have been put together for whatever reason, but if they have been put intentionally together, then we interpret them in a different way.
And I guess pushing back again a little bit farther on Sasha and in response to Arjen, I would say that what we do is look at other contemporaneous examples, and Chris Krause just privately chatted me in the box and there's not time for her question, but there are many examples in the Greek and Latin materials that do represent the kind of collection or the aggregate that we're trying to point to from the Hellenistic world. And we can also draw on some of those examples with respect to meaning, interpretation, and growth. And what I loved, Eibert, one of the things, Eibert, if I can just, one of the things you said in the paper, which were wonderful, is the way Eibert then started talking about the longer and the shorter text and developed it quite off script from what we had done before. It was really great, Eibert, because that's such an important point, that sometimes the shorter text or the shorter collection also shows signs of thinking and hermeneutical reflection, so that we can see deletion also as an interpretative gesture.
Okay, Jeremy has a different kind of question. I'll just briefly try to cover it. It's a 2-part question. He wants to know, on the basis of scribal practices, is it possible that in a time when they're trying to preserve these texts because of impending disaster, that it could have been that they were put together mechanically for not very intellectual reasons, but just from accident? And then he also asks, is it possible that some of the scribes really didn't know what they were copying? So it's purely a mechanical process, the way some of these texts are put together.
Yeah, very quick answer. If we think the time of disaster, the time of the Romans, so we think about, let's say, the 60s or whatever, but the scrolls that we have, actually, they come from a period of 3 centuries. And it would be an interesting question. I never looked at that. So to see whether there's differences of collection through time. I can't state anything from the top of my head about that, but don't think that everything has been written very quickly in time of disaster.
Can I just add?
Other question, did they know what they were copying? To different extents. We see very skilled scribes who could just, who become co-authors of texts, and we see pupils who don't really know the spelling of correct Hebrew and Aramaic, who occasionally they didn't know what they were copying. In the case, there's a few cases where they were copying sections from Job or other things that were so difficult that they broke up the words wrongly, etc. And then someone else corrected them. So they didn't know everything. Not everyone knew everything.
But Eibert's being extremely humble here, and I really feel like I need to speak a bit more. And I think also George Brooks stepped away. He was here earlier. Eibert has worked on this extensively, as has George Brooks. And part of what a paper you recently gave in Oxford to show scribes thinking out loud. This is incredible. Not only do we have the bands and the ties that we saw how scribes cared for their scrolls, but we also watch and see how they corrected, how we had teachers and students working together and thinking. We can watch them think, to the extent that although Eibert would not talk about the author function, he will nevertheless sometimes talk about the scribe that he has come to know. And he's convinced me, I was super skeptical, but he's convinced me of coming to know people through their handwriting and through the correction and the way in which they think out loud in the manuscripts. And it's an amazing phenomenon. It's an amazing kind of practice and refined mode of reading as we come to understand their reading practices as scribes. I don't think what we see here, at least in the scrolls, where we see self-consciousness on the part of the scribal community, and please, Eibert, tell me if I'm overstating the case, we see scribes that are thinking creatively, that are articulating the text, performing the text through I would say kind of oral textuality, or that is, the texts themselves are being performed. And Jeffrey Kahn has done a lot of this already, going back to the Second Temple period. Jackie Weintraub just wrote about this oral transmission, but it's about textualized transmission. And this is done in the hands of scribes. And I don't think it's insignificant that our scribes will come to be called prophets. Ezra himself will come to be called a Navi, and already in second Esdras and fourth Ezra. And I think that's significant. So I want to push back. I don't want to say that we can find meaning in everything and there aren't people that are hired to copy, but we do see a lot. I mean, Eibert, does that seem like a fair representation of some of the work you've done on scribal markings, scribal corrections, assembly also of pieces of scrolls together?
More in general, I would say, also responding to what Sasha and other ones are chatting at the same time. I think we have a large variety of scrolls and of competence of scribes, and I don't think that every beginning pupil was doing the same as what Hindy was describing now, but we have, I would say, we have a lot of scrolls that betray or that witness to the kind of actively engaged in matters of interpretation or creating new texts. And Sasha, of course, is right, but there's often a connection between, let's call it sloppy or inelegant writing and sloppy or inelegant orthography, and also doing other things wrong. But it's great to look at that. I love all the scribes just as much, whether they do it neatly or just make a mess of it. And
right, that's a very good answer. So we're just running out of time, but we have one last question for which we can have a very quick, short answer from both of you. And that is that considering the nature of your research on collections, do you think this is in future these works will be renamed and reorganized according to what you're finding?
I think we are continuously renaming and reorganizing them, often individually, because the field as such doesn't like it if everyone just gives new names. But certainly we have to rename and rename, certainly reorganize sometimes.
And we do this, we need to do this. I'm going to just extend and expand on what Eibert already said. We do this, we need to do it as a community. To do it idiosyncratically or individually is not to have the right kind of impact. So we tread carefully, we tread slowly, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Eibert and I got a fair amount of flack when we wrote the nomenclature article, which I assume that question is coming from. But we, in our rewrites, we spoke with the first generation of scholars, and we tried to consult them and also their notes. We have many notes to try to understand what they were thinking and why they were thinking it. They tried to fit the texts that they found into categories, mystical categories, early Christian categories, rabbinic legal categories, biblical categories. And Emmanuel Tove said to me, we did the best we could do. We needed to get them out so you could read them. And there are many students in this community today, I see in the list. We're doing this and giving it to you so that you could take these texts on for future research. We think that the work we're doing, and we mean to be doing it together with a community of scholars, might require some renaming, or at least to say, when you call something Sefer Razim, or when you call something the Genesis Apocryphon, we must free some of these texts from the categories that were imposed on them, because we want to be able to read them, for example, in closer conversation with New Testament, with rabbinic texts, early Christian texts, and also Hebrew Bible texts and contemporaneous texts. And the only way we can do it sometimes is to suspend the very name. We know that in antiquity, these names or titles, psalm titles, confined and explicated. And we did this, and now and we have to allow ourselves to release somehow the constraints that we put on these texts and read them anew. And so the answer is absolutely yes, but we do it carefully. We try to do it in conversation with scholars. And as we do it, we try to bring more and more people into this conversation so we can do so responsibly and in a way that fundamentally integrates the Dead Sea Scrolls into their proper place, which is the larger imagination of ancient Judaism.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call this session to a close. We've had wonderful discussions here, very stimulating talks. Thank you, Sasha, also for your intervention. And I think we've had some very good questions and even better answers. So I think we've given us a lot to think about. I think this is a wonderful way to start off this new lecture series. You've done a terrific job of inaugurating our first online public lecture. And I think we can also say that this was a great success, thanks to your contributions. So I just like to wish everyone a very good night, right? And oh yes, and we have to thank our Sarah Ben Isaac for doing all of the hard work and organizing these lectures. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone.
Another lecture next week coming
Yeah,
up.
we have another lecture next week. We have Daniel Boyarin from Berkeley, and we're looking forward to all of you attending. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.